Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. As always, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for supporting the show. My apologies to you, Clay. I cut you off during the show and you didn't get to update people on your book and your online courses. I shall rectify that during the podcast. This week, after many times discussing it, we actually presented President Jefferson with a portion of the U.S. immigration citizenship test. We started talking to him about immigration during his time, and it really turned out to be great fun.
Well, I cheated. I wrote the answers on
Oh, you did not.
my inner arm, and I pulled up my sleeve from time to time. I couldn't have passed it under a fair test, so I cheated. But this was interesting, and so this comes out of Joe Ellis. So Joe Ellis is our returning champion. We speak to him from time to time at his undisclosed location in Vermont, and he has said, I think 5 or 6 times in the last 6 months, every high school student in America should be required to take the citizenship test. And I think he thinks that they would fail and that, this is sort of a comeuppance kind of thing. I'm not so sure. I don't know the answer to that. It'd be fun to try that. But then I thought, well, if we're gonna be like middle-aged men talking about what every young person should know in that kind of way that men talk, I thought I should take it myself, either as Jefferson or as myself. And so you kind of sprang this on me. I didn't prepare. And I think that it was very, very interesting. And I'm glad we did it. And I would like to actually take the full test. And then I would like to write a letter to the immigration people contesting some of the questions, because I think that no, I'm not talking about Jefferson's politics. I think they need to be very straight. I mean, there can be nothing that's a trick. We should ask for general, not arcane information. So most of the questions that you read out to me seemed really good and legitimate, but a few of them I thought, that's sort of asking a lot of some person from Korea or some person from Ukraine or some person from Nigeria or some person, for that matter, from Canada, that I know they study. That's part of it. But I want people to be good citizens. I don't want them to be experts in minutia, if that's a distinction that makes any sense.
Yes, and without giving too much of the test away before we go to the show, um, Jefferson's response that some of the questions were a bit vague and called for opinion, I thought was well founded.
I think it's very, very interesting to me. So I'm teaching this course at the University of Mary in a few weeks on responsible citizenship, and I'm doing an online course at the same time on Great Plains literature and history, and they're related. So I'm going to take my students around to these places in North Dakota, like Garrison Dam and the Standing Rock Indian Reservation and Fort Mandan and some other places, and we're going to talk about responsible citizenship. So I've been thinking a lot about that, David. What should a 25-year-old North Dakotan know? The answer is they don't know much about our history. And so how can you be a responsible citizen when you don't really ever have to face certain questions? So, among the questions I'm going to ask is, what's our relationship with Native Americans in North Dakota? As you know, it's a long, fascinating, and often troubled history. What's our relationship to the land? How much should we conserve? What should be our conservation ethos? What's our relationship to government or to other states or to Canada, which is just on the other side of the 49th parallel here? What's our relationship to sacred places, to places that have more than usual landscape meanings for one reason or another, and who gets to decide those questions? And so I think we don't think enough about citizenship. When I don't know, you tell me, when I was back in high school, I had to take a citizenship course. It was essentially ridiculous, but we took it. Did you have a citizenship course?
Well, I remember civics in junior high. I remember civics, and I remember my teacher distinctly, Mrs. Youngnich. And it was something that everybody kind of went, oh, civics. But it was a great class for a 7th or 8th grader to take, and it has stuck with me all these years.
I think it's important. I think we should return to this, and I think we should return to ethics courses too, but there should be state citizenship courses because citizenship in Massachusetts is in some regards different from citizenship in Utah or Hawaii. And so I really am in favor of this. And from a Jeffersonian point of view, that's the purpose of public education. Public education is publicly funded because citizens are made as well as born. You're born with rights, but you don't really know how to live in a republic or any constitutionally based society unless you learn certain
Yeah.
things.
I'm real close to going on a rant here. We should probably tie this up
Give me the short version of your rant.
the people that are out protesting saying, "You're taking away my rights when you make me wear a mask." I mean, really? That's infringing on your rights? I mean, really? That's a short version of my rant.
We have weaponized masks. I know a lot of people who feel that it's a question of their constitutional liberties under the Bill of Rights, and so I respectfully disagree with them, and it does seem to me to be insane. But
Yeah, well, let's be consistent. Okay, if that's the case, then how come I have to have car insurance? How come I have to have a driver's license? How come it's just simple common sense. I don't get the motivation. So stop me and tell us about your book and about your online courses, and let's go to the show.
well, I want to say a couple of things that are really important here. Number one, Ken Burns. Ken Burns' new 6-hour documentary on Ernest Hemingway is spectacular.
Yeah, it's very good.
I watched it. Now I'm rewatching it. You can watch it at any time. You can stream it on pbs.org. I'm not a gigantic Hemingway fan, but I love some of his work, especially the early short stories. And I love all of his work to a certain degree. I'm not as fond of him, but I watched the series because it's Ken Burns, and it is one of the best things he's done. And let me tell you why, I think. Not only does he have an incredible cast of talking heads, writers, Edna O'Brien, Tobias Wolff, and others. Here's what I loved about it, David. Thanks to the Treasury at the JFK Presidential Library, they had access to Hemingway's manuscripts. And his manuscripts are written in a legible English penmanship and also typescripts. And what they did, as you saw, David, was they went in and did magic scanning. And so you could actually watch a typescript unfolding as if he were typing it and you were standing over his shoulders. And when he made adjustments or crossed something out or crossed out a whole page, they show that. They don't add anything. They're not distorting the documents. They're just deconstructing them and reconstructing them. So this is the closest we will ever get to being in the room with a great writer and watching him or her compose and ponder and revise and cross out and start over. It is one of the greatest techniques. We all know the Ken Burns technique of the way that he moves across images, but this is new, and this is an unbelievably clever, creative thing, and it makes the film much deeper and more meaningful than it otherwise would be. So I was just swept away. So anyway, I really urge people, I know a lot of people who are not particularly Hemingway fans, watch this film because this is what documentary film can be. And you and I have made a few documentaries, and I know that for every thing that happens in like a 2-minute episode, a little module in a documentary film, there are literally hundreds of decisions that have to be made about editing, about angle, about lighting, about audio, about music, about pace, etc. And so this is just something that I was sort of, I guess I'll tune in because I love Ken Burns, And then I just thought, what is wrong with me? This is, I made it my business, those 3 nights, to watch the 2 hours per night, and it never lags. I get a little tired of Hemingway's personality and his own abuse of women, for example, but that has to be told. That's part of the story. And the last thing I'll say about this is that Jeff Daniels, of all people, he had such passion and such understanding of the nuances and the cadences of Hemingway's writing that I just thought, there again, Lynn Novick and Ken Burns chose him, and they chose perfectly.
With that, sir, we should go to the show. You've got just a short bit of time left in this podcast intro to update folks.
Well, virtually by the time they hear this, my book will be out at last. The Language of Cottonwoods, Essays on the Future of North Dakota. If you care about this show or me, please consider buying 1 or 100 copies of this book. Christmas is coming. My next online course is on Great Plains literature, including Willa Cather and Kent Haroff, and this really wild book called The Rachel Califf Story, and my own book. So watch for that. Cultural tours are filled for the summer, but the winter encampments and the John Steinbeck trip early 2022 and the Cuba trip early 2022. So let us know about those and much more. But meanwhile, I want to say, David, I passed, and I'm going to have champagne tonight because I am now officially, both as Jefferson and my...
Actually, no, you didn't pass. You didn't pass. Jefferson passed.
Yeah, that's it.
All right, on to the show.
On to the show. Thanks, everyone.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and I am so pleased to be speaking with you, Mr. Jefferson. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, my dear citizen.
I trust your gardens are beginning to green and you are harvesting small amounts of produce at this time of the year, sir.
Well, at this time it's lettuce and peas and, a few early things that come to table fairly quickly in the growing season. But tomatoes and maize, corn, that comes much later.
Mr. Jefferson, I wanted to talk to you this week a bit about immigration. I mean, we're a nation of immigrants, either fresh ones or citizens who have roots and ancestors that were immigrants. And I'm curious, sir, during your time, how did you determine who deserved the right to become a U.S. citizen?
Well, we were underpopulated at that time. When I was born, there may have been 2.5 million Americans. When I wrote the Declaration of Independence, maybe 3.5 million. And when I became the President of the United States on March 4th, 1801, possibly as high as 6 million Americans. Well, that's a tiny population. 1 in 5, by the way, was a slave at that time. The population beyond the Appalachian Mountains of Anglo-Europeans was about 250,000, maybe not that many. So we had this huge continent. At the time, our sovereign territory led up at least to the Mississippi River, and we had this very small American population. So we welcomed immigrants. Things were relatively wide open. But then, of course, politics distorted the picture, because during the French Revolution and all that followed, the United States became, certainly conservatives in the United States became concerned about immigration from France, and then immigration from Haiti after the Haitian Black Revolution. And so that was the point in 1798, during the administration of my friend John Adams, that the Congress passed the Alien, Naturalization, and Sedition Acts. And the Sedition Act is not particularly important in this context, but the Alien and Naturalization Acts were. The Alien Act allowed the executive, the president, to expel from this country anybody that he regarded as a security risk who was not an American-born citizen. And this was intended to censor, to shut the mouths and pens of French immigrants who were radicalized by the revolutionary ferment of the Enlightenment and the beginnings of the French Revolution. And then there was the naturalization law, which was intended to prevent new immigrants from coming to the country. That changed from 5 to 14 years, the amount of time that a foreign-born person needed to be in residence in this country before he could become a United States citizen. This was at a time when life expectancy was about half of what it is in your era. So this was a very severe postponement of the fruits of citizenship. So this issue of who belongs, who's a citizen, how open should America's welcome be, how open should our borders be, This has existed in one form or another from the beginning of American history, and it came into a crisis in 1798. I will tell you that I regarded the alien, sedition, and naturalization laws as worthy of the 9th or 10th century. That seemed almost an inquisition intended to prevent the rise of the Republican Party, the party that I helped to create with James Madison. These anti-immigration strictures were brought about in part because of fear of foreign meddling in American life, but also because the Federalists, the conservatives, believed that every new American, all these refugees, would undoubtedly support my emerging political party rather than the Federalists who then held power.
You speak about the need for population during that time in America. Uh, for some context, we look at the first permanent English settlement in North America, which is generally regarded as Jamestown in Virginia, and it was founded in 1607. In your studies of Virginia history, Mr. Jefferson, were you aware of the colony at Jamestown?
Oh, yes, of course. This was part of the history of Virginia and part of the mythology of Virginia. No, we understood that story very well. Of course, Jamestown is only a handful of miles from Williamsburg, which was then the capital of colonial Virginia. So everybody knew of it. We often toured it. Yorktown was not so far away from Jamestown. And the whole story of Pocahontas and Captain Smith was something every child in Virginia could recite. It was one of the 3 or 4 standard stories of the historical memory, even of our own time. And I had relatives, including Thomas Mann Randolph, my son-in-law, who claimed descent from Pocahontas. A very large number of people believed that somehow their genealogy touched the Powhatan natives. Whether this was true or not is hard to establish, but it was part of the cachet of the Virginia gentry to claim somehow descent from Pocahontas.
According to contemporary historians, the first U.S. census in 1790 reported a total population of around 3.9 million, and almost all of these were immigrants.
Well, all of us were, frankly. You know, the first people came to Jamestown, and then there was Plymouth up in Massachusetts, and you know, there had been some attempts by Sir Walter Raleigh and his compatriots to create a colony at Roanoke or in the Outer Banks of our North Carolina. So this was a time when Europeans were colonizing the Western Hemisphere and other places in the world. Jamestown was rightly regarded as the first permanent English settlement in America, although it had a very rough go. So we all knew this story, and this had begun in the 16th, but really mostly the 17th century, and then things began to happen very fast. So when that census was taken in 1790, shortly after the Constitution was ratified, the count was of immigrants. I mean, everyone had come from either England or Scotland or Ireland or France or the Low Countries. There were some Germans. These were the Pennsylvania Dutch. There were a few others. But this was the population of the country, and of course Africans and African slaves. And that numbered, as you say, something under 4 million in 1790, but it had almost doubled by the time I was inaugurated for my second term in 1805.
It's hard to discuss population in America during your time, sir, without noting Mr. Franklin's article, Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind, Peopling of Our Countries, etc., which was written in 1751. It talks about population growth and its limits. Mr. Franklin had some unique views on population, did he not?
Well, he was an optimist. I'm an optimist. The fertility of the New World, the amount of free land that was available, the resources that had never been tapped in human history, the distance from all of the oppressive habits and institutions and individuals of the old world meant that humans were going to flourish in America. There was no question that our population was going to grow uh, dramatically more quickly than the populations of the Old World. And the Old World was, in many respects, unable to feed itself. And many of the poorest people from England and France and elsewhere came to the New World seeking a better life, seeking opportunity. So we had no choice but to be optimists in the face of all of this. Probably there was never a more optimistic moment in the history of civilization. But Franklin was really offended by the pamphlet by Malthus, a man named Thomas Malthus, who had said that the population inevitably in all countries outgrows the capacity of the food supply to feed it. And this leads to social distress and also famine. And Franklin wrote a response to that, saying this just will not happen in the New World, because we have so much land and it's so fertile that we are likely to be able to support an immense population, and that Malthus's theory is really an Old World theory about a corrupted set of societies that have class hierarchies, and the land has been unevenly divided and the resources are unevenly distributed, and people are kept in bondage or social subordinations that are entirely unnatural. And that habit, which has really ruined the life for millions of people in the Old World, is unlikely to replicate itself in this, our happy republic. So I share his optimism, and I do think that Malthus was a pessimist, arguing from European circumstances that are unlikely to have a parallel in the New World.
Franklin said that he believed the American population would double every 20 years, and he was essentially correct until the frontier disappeared.
Yes, indeed, he was. And of course, I died in 1826. At that time, Kentucky was a state, Ohio was a state. We were moving into the Louisiana Territory. But most of even the interior of the country to the Rocky Mountains was empty of Euro-Americans. There were native peoples, of course, and we were sending native peoples west to take up empty lands in what would become Oklahoma and elsewhere to get them out of harm's way. We thought there was infinite space, essentially, but we were underpopulated at this time, and we could not, in 1826, have estimated the terminus date for the American frontier. I thought we had room enough for hundreds and maybe thousands of generations, and perhaps we do. But I did not expect the whole continent to be peopled as fast as it apparently was.
Mr. Jefferson, we need to take a short break from this conversation. When we come back, I'd like to talk to you more about naturalization, immigration, the requirements during your time. You mentioned the Act of 1790. Perhaps we can talk about that and then maybe discuss some of the requirements for immigration during my time, sir.
That would be useful. Yes, thank you.
We're going to take a short break, but we will return. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Good to speak with you, sir.
Thank you.
We've been talking about immigration, the population of the United States, and I thought it would be interesting to maybe do some comparisons about immigration during your time and immigration during my time. Now, as we have agreed, sir, the United States was populated by immigrants or their descendants during your time almost exclusively. It's said that about half of the population was of English descent. About 20% was of African descent, of course, enslaved people against their will. The rest was made up of Scotch, Irish, very small amount of Spanish, French, Dutch. Does this match what you know, sir?
Yes, but add to that Germans. So when we speak of Pennsylvania Dutch, we really mean Pennsylvania Deutsch, and the land beyond the Appalachian Mountains in the interior of Pennsylvania, but also Virginia. There were a large number of people from what would become Germany later in the 19th century.
According to some historians, sir, colonists sort of had the idea that they were going to civilize indigenous people. You had that belief as well, did you not?
Well, yes and no. So I was fascinated by Native Americans. Uh, I admired them in so many ways. Uh, at least I admired what I understood to be their system. So there are several areas. One is the amount of small d democracy. There was a huge amount of individual sovereignty of persons, of warriors, of individual people in the Indian world, much more than in the European world. And so that great individualism, that great personal freedom, was something that we looked on with a sense of wonder. We were looking at ourselves through a lens deep into the past. This must be what we were like at some point deep back into the history of Europe and Asia. And so this gave us a chance to examine ourselves in a more natural state. Yes, yes, I wanted native peoples to assimilate up to a certain degree. Why wouldn't they want the best of our civilization? Now, think of the capacity of written languages to make civilizations advance, or think of metallurgy, a kettle, a needle, a hatchet, an awl. These tools are dramatically, almost infinitely superior to stone and bone implements of the kind that native peoples were able to create from flint or from the bones of antelope or mule deer or buffalo. So, of course, we wanted them to have the best of what civilization can produce. And we also, frankly, wanted their land. And we knew that if they would cease to be nomadic, cease to hunt for a living and take up farms or some form of agriculture that was settled, that this would make them more prosperous and would free up an enormous amount of territory beyond the Appalachian Mountains for American settlement. So it's complicated, but I certainly admired what I understood to be the Native American approach to life. I didn't think we could do it ourselves, and maybe we didn't really even want to live quite that way, but nobody who examines Native American culture can come away without a deep respect for the heroic individuality of those peoples.
Well, your admiration of Native peoples, the anarchy of Native Americans, as you put it, noted, sir, but there really was no path to citizenship for Native Americans, for indentured servants, slaves, some free blacks were excluded. You spoke earlier about the Naturalization Act of 1790 and then 1795 and the requirements for people to gain citizenship in the United States. One of the requirements during my time, sir, is a written test, which perhaps you would be willing to answer part of.
Well, I could try, keeping in mind that I lived between 1743 and 1826, so my knowledge will be highly imperfect. But yes, there have always been tests of one sort or another for new citizens. I think it's actually a good thing, because so many peoples who come from nations that have never had a Bill of Rights or a Magna Carta or even a constitution for that matter, peoples who have never known freedom, who have never known that individuals are born with rights. And these are truths, they're deep truths and rights that come with us by virtue of birth, but most of the people of the world have never had the luxury of living in a society or under a government that respected human rights. And so when they come here, they're often bewildered by the staggering freedom of American life. And we need to train them. We need to inculcate in them an understanding of their natural rights, an understanding of our basic documents and the ways, the norms with which we adjust public life here in the United States. So I think these tests are on the whole a good thing, as long as they are not designed with an exclusionary purpose.
As they were during your time, in order to become a citizen, you had to be a free white male property owner. And there's some clause in there about good character, which in fact sort of still exists during my time.
Well, let me say that we did have a property requirement in most places during my lifetime. I was one of the handful of national figures who argued against a property requirement. I believed in universal white manhood suffrage. Some women voted, at least for a time, in New Jersey, right after the high idealism of the revolution, and free blacks in some cities, in some northern places, were allowed to vote, but slaves, of course, not, and most women not, because we believed that women were subordinate or coordinate, rather, with the men they lived with, their fathers, their uncles, their brothers, their sons, their cousins, and so on, and that these men would have a benevolent supervisory role in protecting the needs and the rights of the women to whom they were allied. And so this was just a way of seeing in my time. I know that you no longer see it quite that way. And there were people who protested that, including Mary Wollstonecraft and our own Abigail Adams and our own Aaron Burr, for that matter. And Indians, Native Americans, we did not include because we thought they were foreign nationals. In other words, we didn't include the French either, or the Germans, or the Italians, or the Poles, or the Hungarians. Our social compact involved American citizens, and we believe the Creeks and the Seminoles were foreign nations that happened to live within the larger jurisdictions of North America. We addressed them in a bilateral fashion as nation to nation, and in a famous series of decisions, my cousin John Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in the 1820s and 30s, formulated American policy with respect to Native peoples, and he called them, and I'm quoting, domestic dependent nations. They weren't full sovereigns the way, say, Iceland would be a sovereign or Hungary would be a sovereign, but they were domestic dependent sovereigns, so separate from us, a different nation, a different legislative system, but yet in a kind of a trust relationship with the emerging American empire. And that also finds its expression in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 that called upon us to show the utmost good faith. That's the term, the utmost good faith in all of our relations with Native peoples.
Well, it is difficult, sir, because it to me is evidence of a form of racism that existed during your time that still exists during my time. That is, um, the feeling of superiority of white male property owners. But moving on from that, talking to people today about citizenship is far different than during your time, of course. But I would share with you some of the requirements during my time to become a U.S. citizen. There are two ways to become a U.S. citizen, either through birth or through naturalization. And some of the requirements to become a U.S. citizen during my time, just some of them, sir, are that you must be 18 years of age, you must have lived in the United States for 5 years, and here, sir, it also lists that you must be a person of good moral character. You must demonstrate an attachment to the principles and ideals of the U.S. Constitution, be able to read, write, and speak basic English, and have a basic understanding of U.S. history and government. And also, sir, take an oath of allegiance to the United States.
I'm not really in favor of oaths. I object to them, in fact. I think that's a holdover from a world in which religion had a official status. I think that oaths of any sort are probably a mistake, but I can see why that might be a relatively harmless provision in our naturalization system. I support all of those so far as I understand them from your list. The only one that's hard to make sense of is a good character. Good character is very hard to measure. I don't know what test there is for it. Character is revealed over time. And so if you naturalize a person from, say, Scotland, you don't know whether that person has good character for 5, 10, 15 years, perhaps. But I understand the desire for people of good character. It's just hard to measure and hard to enforce.
Noted, sir. Uh, this this could be fun if you'd be willing to participate. I thought perhaps I would present some of the questions on the test that exists during my time. Would that be agreeable?
This could be embarrassing.
I, I think not, sir. Principles of American Democracy. Question one: what is the supreme law of the land?
Well, the Constitution of the United States would be the supreme law of the land, of course.
And what does the Constitution do?
It organizes our public lives. It embodies the will of the people by way of a formal government, in our case consisting of three coordinate national branches.
And what are the first three words of the Constitution?
Well, this is the work of Gouverneur Morris. You know, Gouverneur Morris was never a governor. His name just happened to be Gouverneur. He was a high Federalist. I knew him. He replaced me in France as the American minister. I knew him in Paris. He's a very high-toned sort of fellow. I had a wooden leg, and he told wild stories about how he had lost his leg, none of which were probably really true. But he was a very fine prose stylist, and when the Constitution makers who met in Philadelphia decided they needed a draft of the actual language, they'd worked out the mechanics, but now they needed wonderful language to embody the principles of the Constitutional Convention. They turned to a committee of style, and the chief person there was Gouverneur Morris, and he's the one who wrote the famous preamble, which begins with the three words, "We the people."
Question number 4. What is an amendment?
An amendment can happen in several ways. There are amendments to congressional legislation, but I think the sense of this must be the amendments to the Constitution. One of the problems with the Articles of Confederation, which was the first Constitution of the United States, is that it was almost impossible to amend. It took a unanimous vote of all 13 original colonies, original states, and that proved to be essentially impossible. So the important thing about a Constitution is that you can amend it to keep pace with the progress of the human mind, to keep pace with changes in technologies and demographics and so on. And so the Founding Fathers, the 55 who met in Philadelphia, wisely put in an amendment clause, and an amendment requires a very high test in the United States, perhaps too high, in my opinion, 2/3 majority of each House, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and then 3/4 of the states. The states can also generate amendments without Congress, but it's much more difficult. So the amendment process is a way to keep the Constitution current with the progress of the nation.
Mr. Jefferson, there are 100 questions on this test, and I'm certain we won't have time to go through all of them, but would you consent to answer a few more?
Yes, I'm trying to stall so I can have a perfect record here.
Well, you're doing very well. Question 5. What do we call the first 10 amendments to the Constitution?
These are Mr. Madison's great gift. I played a role in this in insisting that we needed such amendments. They're called the Bill of Rights, sir.
Question 6. What is one right or freedom from the First Amendment?
Oh, well, the right to assemble, the right to petition for redress of grievances, the right to worship as one pleases without pressure of any sort from our government, freedom of the press. This, in my opinion, is probably the most important of the 10 amendments, although I'm also very fond of the 10th. Those powers not delegated to the national government belong instead to the states and to the people.
This next question might be a bit tricky from your time to mine. Perhaps you could answer it from my time. How many amendments does the Constitution have?
Not enough is the answer. You've been at this now for 230 years, and you've only had 27 amendments, and the first 10 were essentially an afterthought. They were an extension of the Constitution itself. So if you eliminate those as sort of the second round of the initial constitutional process, you've only had 17 in the subsequent couple of centuries. It seems to me you need many more amendments than that, or you need to tear up your Constitution from time to time. But I refuse to believe it would be exceedingly irrational to believe that in 230 years you've only required 17 adjustments to the Constitution. That would lock you into some sort of ridiculous notion that the Constitution is a sacred document, too rarefied, too deeply woven into scripture in American life to be touched.
Question number 8. What did the Declaration of Independence do, sir?
Well, I wrote it, so this one I should be able to get right, I think. It separated us formally from Great Britain, but it also submitted to the world, to the candid world, a list of our grievances. And those grievances, in my opinion, in their entirety, add up to a requirement that we declare independence. It was no longer a useful option. It was now essential that we separate and form our own social compact that would be more likely to honor the rights of man and help us in our pursuit of happiness.
What are two rights listed in the Declaration of Independence?
The Declaration of Independence, two rights. Well, I said everyone is born with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's something I essentially borrowed from John Locke, but I should say, and I'm sure that's the answer, but that's not really what the Declaration of Independence was intended to do. That's just the preamble. The Declaration of Independence was intended to lay out the case for our revolution so that we could justify it in the eyes of the candid world, so that the people who understood all of this would side with us and realize that we had been very patient in the face of British tyranny, and we deserved now to be an independent republic. But among other things, the Declaration says that we should do what countries do: coin money, create armies, establish justice. These are the things that a nation does, are enumerated towards the end of the Declaration of Independence, and these powers then were assumed by us on July 4, 1776.
Mr. Jefferson, we need to take a short break. I wonder if we could break protocol and get you to join us for one more segment of conversation and continue this citizenship test. I'm certain you're curious to see how you'll do.
Not very. I was hoping to quit while I'm ahead here, but with your insistence, sir, I will submit to further questioning in the next portion of this program.
You are a true gentleman, Mr. Jefferson. We shall take a short break and return to this citizenship test with Mr. Jefferson in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson, thank you so much for agreeing to stay a bit longer and continue to participate in this citizenship test from my time.
I am feeling a migraine coming on, so I may disappear on you.
Sir, you are doing extremely well. And we are, as I say, the citizenship test for new citizens, and we're in the first portion of the test. It's quite long, about 100 questions, and this again has to do with American government. And question number 10 is, what is freedom of religion?
Well, that, of course, depends on the eye of the beholder, but freedom of religion means that we are not required to worship any God that does not make sense to us, or attend any church that might be established by government, that we are free to worship the God of our choice and to adhere to the chapel or the congregation of our choice, that we can't be taxed for religious purposes, that would be voluntary tithing or voluntary contributions, and that our religious consciousness is between ourselves and our God, between ourselves and our preacher, but not between ourselves and the state. And this is all embodied not only in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, but also in a letter that I wrote as president to the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut, in which I said that my reading of the First Amendment is that it erects a wall of separation between church and state. And I would say, sir, that this is almost my most important principle, that if you add up all the things that I advocated, and it's a fairly long list, that nothing was as important to me as freedom of conscience.
Question number 11. This could be tricky for you, sir. What is the economic system in the United States?
Well, ideally, in my chosen world, it would be barter, where I have an excess of chickens and you have an excess of hogs, and we trade in a neighborly way. That would be the best possible economy for an agrarian society like ours. But I think the answer comes from Adam Smith, who published The Wealth of Nations in the same year as the Declaration of Independence. He was part of the Scottish Enlightenment. And I think what you're suggesting is that capitalism is the unofficial economic system of the United States of America. I regret some of that because I think banks and money and monetary systems and national debts and so on are on the whole pretty abusive of human happiness.
Number 12 is, what is the rule of law?
That's a relatively vague question, but the rule of law is actually embodied in something that John Adams said, that in this our happy republic, that men are not more important than laws. Laws are more important than men. The rule of law, I said in a letter early in my life, and also in my first inaugural address, was where we go when there's trouble. If there's a rule of law, if there's due process, if we can count on our Fifth Amendment rights, if we know that we will have access to counsel, that we will be tried by a jury of our peers, those norms, those guarantees are what's known as the rule of law, and we must coordinate our human activity to those laws, and they give us a sense of security when trouble comes. But in nations where there is no rule of law, or where the rule of law has been undermined or violated, then people live in a world of uncertainty and caprice in which they fear not only for their property, but for their lives and liberties.
If we might sort of move ahead quickly, I don't want your migraine to overtake you. Perhaps I'll jump through some of these questions that are left. Again, we're presenting questions that are presented to people applying for citizenship in the United States. We move on to the B section, which is system of government. Name one branch or part of the government, sir.
The judiciary, the least important of the three branches.
What stops one branch of government from becoming too powerful?
Checks and balances, Mr. Jefferson, said John Adams. Checks and balances.
Question 15. Who is in charge of the executive branch?
That's the President of the United States, of which I was reluctantly happy to be the third.
Who makes federal laws?
Those laws are made by Congress in two chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and then the President either signs that legislation or allows it to pass by not doing anything, or vetoes it and sends it back to Congress.
Question 17. What are the two parts of the U.S. Congress?
Yes, the House of Representatives, which leans more closely on the will of the people and is reelected every second year, and then the Senate of the United States, 2 from each state, according to the famous compromise at the Constitutional Convention of 1787.
And how many U.S. senators are there? You can answer from your time or mine, sir.
Well, in your time, there are 100. There are 50 states. There were 13 original states. There were 16 and then eventually 17 states during the course of my time as President of the United States. So two from each state.
And we elect a U.S. senator every how many years?
Every 6th year.
Skipping ahead to question 31. If both the president and the vice president can no longer serve, who becomes the president?
Well, that has changed, of course. It's now the Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Question 36. Can you name 2 cabinet-level positions? Now, again, this has changed dramatically from your time to mine, Mr. Jefferson.
I can name them from my own time. There's the Secretary of War, and there's the Secretary of State. I served as the first Secretary of State in the administration of George Washington. And at that time, the Secretary of State was effectively the Prime Minister, a very wide portfolio of things. I actually thought it was too wide for what I wanted to accomplish in that office. It has since been demoted, but it was also the number one way to become the next President of the United States in my time. So I was the Secretary of State for George Washington and became the President, and James Madison was Secretary of State for me and became president, and so on.
This next question, I'll beg you to be brief. What does the judicial branch do?
It undermines our human liberties. These are unelected, unaccountable, unimpeachable beings. They're sappers and miners working overnight to undermine the liberties of the American people. They have some original jurisdiction, but they're also the appellate court of highest rank. And so constitutional questions, thanks to my cousin John Marshall, that gloomy malignity, now are sorted out by the judicial branch.
I'm going to give you a chance to revise that answer from opinion to fact, sir. What does the judicial branch do?
Well, the Constitution says that it has some original jurisdiction and it's the highest court of appeal. The Constitution does not say that it has the power of judicial review. That's probably the answer you're looking for. But I invite anyone who is listening to read the Constitution and find for me any clause that could be construed by even the most wide interpreter of the Constitution as allowing judicial veto of acts of the Congress of the United States. I refuse to revise my answer, sir.
All right. Well, that may be a good place to stop, Mr. Jefferson. So far, do you find these questions agreeable to determine a person's right to citizenship?
Yes, most of them. I would quibble with some. Some of them require interpretation, and some of them suggest a complacency about American life that I don't think is particularly useful. But on the whole, I think that they're very good questions, and I think that people should know how their Constitution works, how laws are passed, how laws are vetoed, what's the difference between the federal government and state and local governments. All those questions, it seems to me, are very important. I think every American person should know the answer to these questions.
Well, I must inform you of question number 62, sir, which is who wrote the Declaration of Independence? Now, you've already answered that, but I thought it would be good for you to know that your name made the test.
That's fine, but does it really matter? If I had never been born, there would be a Declaration of Independence. I'm against this creation of a pantheon of secular saints. They should know what the Declaration of Independence means. They don't necessarily need to know who wrote it.
Yeah, Mr. Jefferson, I believe I do hear that migraine coming on. I'm going to release you from this conversation. And thank you so very much for humoring me and participating in answering these questions. And I hope to speak to you again soon, sir.
Did I pass?
Sir, you did with flying colors.
That gives me some relief. Now, if I can get a loan to keep Monticello open, that will really ease my mind.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jefferson.
You're welcome, sir.
President Thomas Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson, who is going to join us now. And I'll give you time to disrobe your wig and coat, sir.
Wow, I want our listeners to know that we did not rehearse this, that I had no idea what was coming. I was scared to death. I thought I was going to be revoked. I've never looked at the citizenship test of the United States.
It's pretty interesting. I started and just kind of gave Jefferson the 1, 2, 3, 4 through, the first dozen or so. But it's pretty interesting and it's pretty basic. But I agree with Jefferson's assessment. These are things citizens should know.
Well, give us I won't answer them, but give us a few more. Just list another 8 or 10.
Wants to know when the Declaration of Independence was adopted. 13 original states, name 3. What happened at the Constitutional Convention? When was the Constitution written? What is one thing Benjamin Franklin is famous for? Who's the father of our country? Who was the first president? What territory did the United States buy from France in 1803? Is that enough, or should I go on?
Well, those are all slam dunk. In reviewing any of these, did you find any that you either regarded as obscure or difficult or maybe even wrong-headed?
Not really. There's a couple that might be hard. What did Susan B. Anthony do? Naming the president during World War I and World War II. Before he was president, Eisenhower was a general. What war was he in? What did Martin Luther King do? What happened on September 11th, 2001? Naming American Indian tribes. And then there are also some integrated civics questions about geography, which oceans on which border, naming U.S. territories, naming states that border Canada. So it's good. It's very good.
So, I don't think any of those are so difficult. On the other hand, of course, this is our bread and butter, right? This is what we do every single day. So maybe that's unfair, but I would really like to figure out some way to administer this test to the listeners of the Jefferson Hour. The problem today is that you have your internet sitting right in front of you. And so,
yeah, that's how I got all of these from a usgov site, and it has the questions and the answers. So
the other thing, David, is I'd like to take Joe Ellis seriously and see what our high school graduates can do with this. And I don't know the answer to this. They may be better at this than we think, but I would be very interested in administering this test to 100,000 young Americans who are graduating from high school in the year 2021 or 2023 or whatever. The pandemic has distorted this process probably a little bit, but I would very much like to see that. I hope I wouldn't feel the way you do during the Tonight Show when they go out on the street and ask people questions.
Sure.
That usually makes you want to.
I was going to say that it becomes great fodder for late night comedy shows when they do that.
I think what you need to know to be a part of this country is how our government works, and particularly how laws are passed and what citizens' rights are and what citizens' responsibilities are. And so some of them feel a little bit like trick questions where you need to have been sort of following your newspaper or something.
Well, I don't think, I think, it's pretty fair. It really is. And it's very basic stuff that they're asking. And it's not like you have to do like Jefferson and get 100%.
Plus, you don't have to make Jeffersonian commentary on each question. Do you know?
Although I must say, his answer on what the judicial branch does would be maybe a 50-50.
You nearly caused him to storm out of here again. You remember what happened on the Sally Hemings show, but
I do.
That Jefferson hated the judiciary, and it is true. I've taught this Constitution course now twice, and we'll be teaching it again as an online public humanities course. But the Constitution never, in any way, not even in a hint, suggests judicial review. Judicial review is the invention of John Marshall. Now, it didn't come out of his brain. There were some precedents in British life. But this was not something that the Founding Fathers installed into the Constitution of the United States. And it drove Jefferson crazy to think that his cousin in the case Marbury v. Madison in 1803 sort of shoveled this idea into the Constitution of the United States. And so he probably would flunk that one. But do you have any sense from your research on what the pass rate is on this thing? Or is it like a driver's license where you get to take it 300 times?
Yeah, I'm not. No, I don't, and I'm embarrassed that I can't offer that. But we're coming to the close of the program. To summarize, we started with Jefferson talking about the need for immigrants in America, where they came from, and his feelings about it, and we've sort of ended up with where immigration in America is today. And of course, we're not talking about political refugees. We're talking about straight up immigration. Political refugees is a whole nother subject, which would be interesting to have Mr. Jefferson comment on.
Well, let me just say this tiny little thing about that. I wind up being a fairly conservative person on this question. I think a country has to be able to control its borders, that we have to decide who's in and who's out, that you don't have an automatic right to move into a new country. The countries get to determine the basis of citizenship. That's one of the basic sovereignties of a nation. And we have an immigration system. It's highly imperfect and needs reform. It's often been racist. It's often been ungenerous. It certainly was ungenerous during the last presidential administration, but we have to have one. And so we desperately need immigration reform in this country. And we need to decide for the 21st century who's in, who's welcome here, under what circumstances, and in what numbers and percentages. And the fact that we're still fighting about this, and there's another crisis at the border, because the fact is, David, that peoples from poor countries and badly run countries and countries where there's an enormous amount of violence, they gravitate to the haven of America, just as our forebears did for various reasons. And these people are coming here because they're seeking happiness, they're seeking freedom, they're seeking the rule of law, they're seeking economic opportunity, they're seeking what America means with the capital A, spelled in all capitals. And so we need to really have a thoughtful, intelligent, and enforceable immigration policy. And the fact that we don't is putting tens of thousands, even millions of people at risk, their children, their health, the squalor along the border in some places, the coyotes and others who prey upon people who are desperately seeking America. This is a sore, and we thought people might have naively thought that once the Trump administration passed and the new administration came to power, that the things would get better at the border. They don't. People want to come here, and the world south of the border beyond Mexico is extremely, in many cases, unstable. And so we're going to have to face this problem as a rational people. And it just tears me apart to think of the human suffering that is made possible by our imperfect border security system. We'll see you all next week. You take the test, my friends out there, for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.